Okay, so in the last video, we talked about data storytelling and some definitions and the importance of data storytelling. In this one, we're going to talk about the 3 steps of data storytelling. To tell any data story that you might find or create online, there's 3 major steps. The first step is to find the data, to gather the data, because you need something to work with to start with, right? You need some kind of numbers to move forward with. And there's 2 major categories of this data that we might find. Either it's provided for you, where somebody already did the gathering and somebody did the finding, they did the survey and they created it and made it into a CSV or an Excel spreadsheet and put it online, or it's original data and you, the journalist, have to go and aggregate that data yourself. So these are the 2 sources of data. Now, the provided data can come in many forms. There are lots of governmental websites that are required by law to post their data online for journalists or for whoever to use and to have access to for our public information. And the census is one great example of that. The United States Census website has a ton of information. Every 10 years, they do a new census of the nation, getting demographic information and all kinds of information, and they make that publicly available to citizens. And so journalists can use that to tell stories. So if you go on the Explore Data page of the United States Census website, you can explore their data and then download it into a CSV just by clicking a few buttons. You can have it into a comma-separated value or an Excel spreadsheet that you can later take and mold and learn some trends and understand what's happening and build it into a web app or some kind of infographic. So there are sites that are out there that will provide that data for you. Another example of this is data.world. It's a repository website where anybody could gather their data and upload it to this website. You do have to create an account, but once you do, you have a world of data open to you that's already been gathered and provided for you. One of which is this UFO sightings data that I just typed in and found. There are a ton of reports of what people have seen when they saw a UFO, from the exact summary of what they said, to their city, to the date and time that it was reported, to the shape of it. This was a really unique one that I found. I have had contact with an unknown party that can move matter around like Star Trek. I was possibly abducted. This is the kind of beautiful data that's out there that you can find and turn into a story of some sort. Another way to gather data is through what's called an API. That stands for Application Programming Interface. And it's a format that allows apps to talk to one another. So we know that these huge companies like Twitter and Google are going out and gathering data constantly. If you think about Google, they are taking pictures of your home right now. They're getting satellite images. They're getting distances, and we use Google Maps all the time to get us around. Well, Google could take that info and just keep it to themselves. But really what they do is they open up their data portal so that other journalists and organizations can access their huge fire hose of data. Twitter does this as well. Spotify does this as well. Basically, they're tech companies that gather information within their apps, and then they allow that to be used by other apps and other people. And that's called the API, Application Programming Interface. It's a way to interface with a company's data. They open basically a gateway for people who are telling data stories to access. So Twitter does this. I mean, you can imagine how many tweets are constantly being created. Well, Twitter has kind of an open door known as an API that you can access and gather and get that data and turn it into a story. Same with Google, same with Spotify. Lots of examples. One example of this is Yelp. Yelp is an app that we use all the time to find information about businesses and restaurants and give reviews and all kinds of data. Well, Yelp integrates the mapping data from Google. They don't go out and get information about a restaurant's location or hours and things like that. They get that from Google, and Google does provide them with a map, and that is done through the API. That way, a company like Yelp doesn't have to go out and aggregate it for themselves. They can pull it in from Google's API. Spotify has an API. It allows for journalists and storytellers to access information from Spotify themselves to see which artists are being most played right now, and try to get recommended artists and all kinds of things that music journalists can build their own little app or recommendation platform or website that can tell a story with all of Spotify's data. And so they call it their web API. It allows your app to interface with Spotify's data. And Spotify is not just tracking user information, listener information, but you can see that they're tracking things like mood, danceability, energy, tempo, loudness, liveness, acousticness. All of these have numbers that Spotify is using to organize their huge list of artists that reporters can then access and create their own apps. Now, FOIA is another way that you might gather data. FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act. Since 1967, the Freedom of Information Act has provided the public the right to request access to records from any federal agency. That means federal agencies must provide the public with information and data on a lot of the content that they are collecting. It's often described as the law that keeps citizens in the know about their government. Federal agencies are required to disclose any information requested under the FOIA unless it falls under one of 9 exemptions which protect interests such as personal privacy, national security, and law enforcement. So for the most part, government agencies must report their data, and if they don't, then you can fill out a FOIA request that says that we have the right as citizens to have this information. And you may have to request it in the form of some online paperwork, but you can request that data from that organization as well. Sometimes data is hard to get to and it's not really provided for you, but you actually have to do the work to get that data. And so that's called scraping. You can build a program using a language called Python, and there are a lot of other programs out there in software that will do the scraping for you, that will go out and search the data and bring it back to you in a nice, beautiful Excel spreadsheet. One of my colleagues is doing this where they use a scraper to go onto Facebook and find the identity of lots of people that are commenting about this year's elections. And so she's using all that data. Now, Facebook is not providing all of its data, it's only providing some data. And so she had to make use of a web scraper that will automate and go through Facebook's pages and get the data that she needs for her research. And so sometimes it's provided for you, but sometimes you have to gather it, and scraping is one way to do that. Another way to gather your own information is through sensors. There are lots of little sound sensors or impact sensors that can detect information that a journalist can use. Radiolab did an experiment with cicada noises in the Northeast United States, and they put these sound sensors throughout the woods throughout the whole Northeast so they can detect how loud cicadas were being, those bugs that are in trees that are really loud. And then they use that to tell a data story about the loudness of cicadas. So sometimes the data isn't a beautiful spreadsheet, but sometimes you can use sensors to gather that data yourself and then turn it into a story. Another way to gather data is just through Google Forms, where you could build your own Google form for free and then look at the responses and get that information and use it as you need to. The next step of data storytelling is understanding the data, and this can often be the hardest part. Really, the journalist's job is to analyze the data and understand it and find the trends and find what's important. According to the Data Journalism Handbook, it says, in many ways, working with data is like interviewing a live source. You ask questions of the data and get it to reveal the answers, but just as a source can only give answers about which he or she has information, a data set can only answer questions for which it has the right records and the proper variables. This means that you should consider carefully what questions you need to answer even before you acquire your data. And so it's important to come at a data set and ask questions and see it visualized and start asking why certain trends were happening. And so that's why Gary Vaynerchuk had said that if content is king, context is God. Understanding the data is all about context and putting this noise into meaningful data and charts for your user, and sometimes finding that data and finding those trends is the hard part. So this is the data that I found from the UFO sightings, the CSV, and I decided to take it into Excel and start filtering it. And that's a big part of the data journalism process. You have to filter out. So I filtered out just Texas. So these are just the responses in Texas. And then from there, you could take it and sort it and even filter it farther down to just San Marcos and tell the story of UFO sightings just in San Marcos. You can also take things like this was a data set that I found on Austin restaurant inspections from data.world. And so it listed out all the different restaurants in Austin and how clean they are. And you can see that by the score that they were given. And so basically I took that and I wanted to find out what are the dirtiest restaurants in Austin, right? And so I sorted it by, and you can do that here within Excel, you can sort it by a specific column. And so I found the column of the scores and I went from lowest to highest. So if you've ever been to Ichiban at Austin, it is the lowest scored in terms of cleanliness. Now that was back in 2016, so I think they got their act together since then. But these are pretty much the top 10 least clean restaurants in all of Austin, and that is just a basic gathering the data and then sorting it based on its score. And so that's the challenge of data journalists. Find the trends. Where's the story exactly? And so another thing that I did was I took that restaurant data, and not only did I find the dirtiest restaurants in Austin, but then I flipped it and I scored it based on the highest to lowest. And so I wanted to see how many restaurants got a score of 100, so perfectly clean restaurants. And so this was data from 2014, 2015, and 2016. And so I compared those 3 years to see how many 100 ratings that these restaurants were given. And that is a big decrease in 2016. So there's a lot of questions that you have to ask. Like, okay, was there legislation that maybe made it harder for restaurants to get 100 ranking? Was there a new person or a new format for how they rank these restaurants? And that is the challenge again, is not just that there's all this data, but finding the angle of the story that you want to take. The third part of the data journalism steps is to communicate the data. Most often, this is done through data visualizations, interactives, and websites. And so it allows the user to visualize the data in a unique way. This is a word cloud that I made using all the different descriptions of UFO sightings. And so this could be another way that you visually represent a story and communicate the data in a visually appealing way. And these are both examples of infographics, information in a graphic. Now, another way to do that is through an interactive chart, and Google offers lots of different interactive charts for free where you can take their code and embed it into your website and turn it into a table that will look like an interactive chart, not just a flat picture of a certain graph, but one that a user can interact with and hover over and make it a little bit more personal for them. Another example of this is Tableau. Tableau offers a huge gallery of interactive graphics, maps, charts, and all those kinds of things that allows you to interact with it. Another interesting one that I recently saw, it's coronavirus related, is you can make a little calculator that decides how long you'll last with the toilet paper that you have. So you can see here that if you type in the number of rolls that you have versus how many visits you have per day, it will tell you how long you'll last. So this is a basic calculator. It's a way to calculate something, and that's basically what that How Y'all and You Guys Talk quiz that the New York Times created. It was basically a calculator. Where are you from? What's your demographic? But the beauty of this data is it's accessing a database, and it allows you to interact with it on a personal level. It allows you to type in your own information, so now the story isn't just about the fact that people are going crazy over toilet paper right now, but it makes it personal to you to see how long you're going to last with the toilet paper that you have. This is another really interesting interactive. It goes beyond just having a chart or a graph, but it allows you to interact with it. It was put on by thepudding.cool, and it allows you to see the vocabulary in hip-hop artists. And so you can kind of hover over and see what each of these hip-hop artists, the unique number of words that they use on average, and you can find a specific artist that you're looking for. So if you want De La Soul, it'll populate that and it'll tell you how many unique words. All the way up to A$AP Rock, which has the most unique words, and all the way down to NF, who has the least number of unique words. And this is a data-driven story that takes music data and turns it into an interactive that allows the user to interact, and it makes it a lot more personal to the user. This was another interesting one that I saw on the rise of the coronavirus. And this specifically talks about the number of cases in the US and also how viruses spread. And you can see here that using very basic infographics, they're taking data and they are creating animations, and in just HTML and CSS, they're building these really interesting stories using data. And this is a randomizer. Every time it goes through, if one person contracts a virus, and then once they contract the virus, they are now immune. And so those are the purple ones. And you can see basically change over time of people who get sick and slowly become immune. And so they were talking in this one about what happens when you quarantine certain people from the mix, and what happens when you start self-quarantining. Only a few people can interact and get sick. And this is just a very interesting story, very visual, that allows you to understand both what's happening with the coronavirus and also the importance of staying quarantined during a time like this. And so why do we tell data stories? Well, they provide a level of depth, customization, and long shelf life that traditional stories really couldn't provide us in the past. And I think about a really interesting story that the New York Times put out called Rent versus Buy. And it was basically a calculator that allowed you to type in what area you wanted to move to and how long you plan to live there and how much money you have in savings and how much you want to put down on a house and what the mortgage rates are and the taxes and all this information. It allows you to type in your information, and it calculates for you if it's better for you to rent in that area or to buy a house in that area. And that is not just a story about real estate in New York or real estate in your area, but this allows you to be part of the story, to see not just if generally it's a good time to buy a house, but this allows you to say, when is the best time for you to buy a house specifically? That provides a level of depth. It's comparing data, tons of data that was already aggregated and found from a database. It allows you to customize it and personalize it to you and your needs. And it gives a long shelf life. That data calculator was created about 8 years ago, and it's still in existence. And as long as the New York Times updates their database on data, it's still a really good calculator, no matter how long after the fact it is. And so stories like that really provide a level of depth, customization, and long shelf life that a traditional story, just about a one-off moment in time, really couldn't support. And so every story really has a data angle, and that is more and more the job of a data journalist, is not just to tell one story about one situation, though those can be very powerful, but to back up and look at data in general and to see how data can support your story, and also if you can find new stories within those trends and within that data that you have. And it's more and more an interesting and increasingly popular area of study for journalists and storytellers.